Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Today I will be talking about my shortlist predictions for the Women's Prize for Fiction. This year I've read 10 books, which is kind of insane, honestly. I started reading books for this prize, I think in 2021, and that first year I read about 5 or 6 before the shortlist got announced. And last year I think I only read 4. I was a lot busier with school and work, but this year I managed to read 10. So I feel like I have a bit more of a say on the predictions than in previous years. I think I always kind of made predictions partially based on what I liked, as well as what other people were saying, but I feel a bit more authoritative now, if you will. So the Women's Fiction Prize shortlist is going to be announced April 26th this year. I believe that's this coming Wednesday, and the winner will be announced June 14th, so still quite a bit of time to finish the remaining 6 books for me, and whatever might be left for you on your list. But without further ado, here are my shortlist predictions. And they are mostly based on what I enjoyed, a little bit based on what other people enjoyed. There are a couple books on here that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of, but I can see them doing better than maybe some other books that I might have liked more, but I don't necessarily see as moving on to the shortlist for various reasons. And honestly, I liked most of the books, like a decent amount so far of the 10 that I read. There were a couple that I didn't really like, and then a few that were books that I know won't be super memorable for me, but that they were fine to read in the moment. And there were a few that I liked quite a lot. So anyway, now, truly without further ado. So the first book on my predictions list is, perhaps to no one's surprise, The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. She is a pretty well-known author, although not one that I'd read before, but she has previously won the prize for her book Hamnet. So I will not be surprised if this book makes it forward. It was really good. I really enjoyed it, on top of her being a pretty well-known author. She was one of the only 2 names I recognized on the long list, which was pretty fun for me, honestly, to get to discover a lot of new voices in the literary world, as well as some who maybe had been around for a while but hadn't been on my radar. I also felt a little out of touch, out of the loop, honestly, seeing all these names that I didn't recognize. But in the end, I think it was fine, because I ended up liking a lot of these books. Anyway, this book specifically, it had a bit of a slow start for me personally. I enjoyed the writing, but I don't know, the first 50 pages were kind of just alright. But the book really did begin to pick up. The last 50 pages were extremely exciting for me. I didn't know how it would end, despite it being based off of a true story. We follow a young Duchess, Lucrezia de Medici. She got married at age 15, I believe, and she died within a year later. And the sort of official cause of death was some sort of illness, but there are rumors that she was poisoned by her husband. And she's this fairly obscure figure from history. I don't think a lot is known by her. If you Google her, if you look her up on Wikipedia, I think unless you are a scholar of this time period or of Italian nobility, you might have not really heard about her before. But I think that made the book so much more endearing to me, honestly. To put this fairly obscure person who was of significant status in her day and age, but who we don't really recognize much now, but you put her front and center in this book and make her very important. You follow her story, and that was really fascinating to me. Obviously there were a lot of liberties, I don't want to say a lot, but there were certainly liberties used in this book about her life, because I don't think there are as many records on her. There aren't many records about her. So it's really interesting, and it kind of just spoke to, that everyone has a bit of a unique and interesting story. We're not all necessarily lost to history. And I think that was shown through certain other characters that were featured in this book, who played more or less prominent roles in Lucrezia's life and in the novel itself. I really enjoyed it, and I do recommend this one. And so that's my first prediction for the shortlist. My second prediction is Pod by Laline Paul. And I did not expect to like this one at all. This is another one that I read pretty early on and really, really enjoyed. I think this one might have been one of my favorites. But this is from the perspective of mostly dolphins and other sea creatures. Well, fully all sea creatures, but mostly a dolphin named Ia, some other dolphins, and yes, other various sea creatures. And when I read that premise, I don't know why, but I thought it was honestly kind of silly and just not like something I would normally be interested in reading, which I'm so glad that I did though. I'm so glad that this was nominated for the long list, because I again would not have read this any other time, any other place. If I saw this at the library or at the bookstore, I almost certainly would not have picked it up. But I ended up loving this book so much. Like I said, it mainly follows this one dolphin named Ia. She is a dolphin in one of these 2 pods that are featured in this book, and all these pods, all these other sea creatures, they kind of come together. Their stories sort of flow, no pun intended, really well together. And I don't know, I thought it was a sweet book about family and companionship. There were definitely some traumatic things that happened in this book, and I recommend looking up any of that. I'm sure it's mentioned in some reviews because there were some difficult things to read about. It was from the perspective of animals, but mirroring definitely some real life things that can happen to people too. The book also definitely discusses like environmental impacts of overfishing and our destruction of oceans and sort of use of animals as well, which I think was very timely and important. It very much made me reconsider eating seafood, honestly, and there are not a lot of books that have made me reconsider like just a day-to-day thing, not a day-to-day thing, but certainly something I just have done without necessarily thinking too much about. So I think that's pretty cool, honestly. My third shortlist prediction is another book that I loved a lot called Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. All I can say immediately about this book is that it made me cry a lot. About halfway through and all the way until the end, honestly, I was kind of sobbing a lot at the epilogue, which I thought was really beautiful. There's a prologue and the epilogue that connect sort of. They both take place quite a few decades actually out from the main story, and I don't know, I thought they were just really beautiful parts of the story. I went back and reread the prologue after reading the epilogue. I don't do that very often, honestly, because I remember the prologue quite often, enough to just like, this is fine, but I don't know, I felt like they were so connected well and just fit in so well with the rest of the book that I had to reread them. So this story follows a woman named Kushla, a teacher and part-time bartender at her family's bar, living in Northern Ireland during the time of the Troubles, which is a conflict I did not know very much about and still don't know a huge amount about, but definitely learned quite a bit throughout the book. She begins an affair with a married man, and the story is very character driven, so it follows that a lot. It follows the lives of her family, really just one of her friends, and the school children that she teaches, and you kind of see how the conflict affects them and affects everyone living in her town. So I think it does a really good job of bringing these very serious real-world events that happened while also following a woman's life and just some very, I don't want to say basic, but just some regular choices that some of us find ourselves making. And I don't know, I mean, I'm sure there's criticisms of her relationship because it's an affair, but I thought it was a really interesting one to read, for sure. And yeah, I don't know, there were a lot of connections in this book that kind of come together for better or for worse, and I really love when a book does that. It's a very, very character-driven story though. Honestly, at the beginning, I wasn't even sure I liked it very much, and I do like character-driven stories generally, but I thought it was just like her going on about her day a lot of the time, especially throughout the beginning, which maybe that was even too much for me. So if you are not already a fan of character-driven stories, I don't know that I recommend this one to you, but I really enjoyed it. The next book is Glory by No Violet Bulawayo, and this one was not a huge favorite of mine. It was alright, but I've seen a lot of other people really enjoy this. I've seen it on some other people's shortlist prediction videos, and I know the author has either won or been nominated for other prizes for this book, so I know I'm in the minority opinion here. This book takes place in a fictional country of Jidada, which is based on the real-world political events of Zimbabwe, and I think it is an important and interesting story to tell, but I'm not sure that the political satire sort of animal way of telling it was just my personal favorite. And it was, I don't know, it sort of dragged a bit for me. There were a few different perspectives, which at times were interesting. Other times I just kind of wanted to focus a little more on one perspective, specifically that of Destiny, who, like on the cover flap of the book, it sort of made it seem like she was like the main character and that this would be following her a lot, but she kind of shows up at one point and then you don't see as much from her, but she and her family had a pretty interesting story that I would have liked to hear more about, and that I don't know, in my opinion, just didn't hear enough about. And I mean, I don't know, I thought it was like funny at times. It was pretty funny to read this book like from these animal perspectives, but that were so obviously like human-like. And so like I'd put this book down and pick it up to read later, and I'd be like, oh yeah, like I don't know, there'd be a description of like an animal like wagging its tail, and be like, oh yeah, we're not reading about humans right now. So yeah, I can see this book moving along to the shortlist. Again, a lot of people have talked about it or have said good things about it. But yeah, for me, not a huge favorite. The fifth book is Wandering Souls by Cecile Pin, and this is another one that I didn't love, honestly, and I wanted to because it was an interesting story, and I'll talk about like the format of this book in a sec, but that's normally something I also like. And I've also seen a lot of positive reviews about this book, so I thought it'd be pretty good. Like the general story was interesting and an important one to tell. It's a refugee story about 3 young siblings fleeing Vietnam during the war and resettling in the UK. But it felt honestly quite disjointed, like the narration did. We're just following so many different perspectives, but kind of, in my opinion, a bit weirdly. You follow the main character An, primarily, but occasionally there's also her brother's perspective. There is a ghost narrator. There's this American soldier, and then an unnamed narrator who I think is a stand-in for the author. And maybe if this was, I don't know, formatted a bit differently or something, it could have worked, but it just really didn't for me. Like it felt very disjointed. And like some of it, like the American soldier perspectives, I think could have been really well done and cool because it revealed certain atrocities that happened during the Vietnam War by Americans that like the main characters, like An and her family, would not have like had that knowledge at the time, so that couldn't have been expressed, but could have been by the soldiers who were there. And I think it sort of like mirrored and maybe properly counterbalanced sort of like optimism about the American dream that a lot of these characters had. So I liked that was included, but these perspectives came so few and far between, like the main story, that it just felt a bit off and just very random. The sort of unnamed narrator confused me at first, and yeah, I don't know, it just unfortunately didn't feel formatted very well, in my opinion. But I might be being a little bit harsh because, again, a lot of people liked this book. And another thing about this book, unfortunately, and you'll hear me say this a lot because I love books that follow a character or a few characters over kind of their entire life. I love seeing characters change, like as people, the environment around them, over decades. Like it is just so interesting to me when they have kids or when they, I don't know, go in and out of relationships or meet other people who are introduced into the story. I think that's so cool. But I did not love that in the story, honestly. It felt too short, so it felt kind of shallow. I was really surprised, honestly, that we ended up following An and her siblings through so much of their life, because it was such a short book. I expected it to be about them fleeing Vietnam, attending or being at a refugee camp, and then maybe the first few years or decade of their life in the UK and kind of settling there. But it was so much more, and at times I appreciated that. It was kind of cool to see where things went with the family, but ultimately, again, it just, like, the author maybe I felt could have dug a bit deeper, and if the book was a bit longer, perhaps it could have happened. But this book does fit into the sort of theme of books about like big historical and political events that I see have pervaded the shortlist a bit. And so I could see it moving on for that reason. I think it is an important subject matter, and I am clearly in the minority of people who didn't enjoy it that much. Okay, and finally the last book, and the only one that I own. I've been borrowing the rest of them from the library, but I bought this one because I couldn't find it at the library, and I don't know, it was one of the more interesting ones to me. So this is Children of Paradise by Kamila Grudova. And I said this in my review when I first made it of this book, that I didn't think this one would make the shortlist. And I'm still fairly uncertain if it will, because it was a very weird book, probably the weirdest book that I read in this prize in the last 3 years. but it was so good. I really liked it. And this might also be a bit of an unpopular opinion. This book does not have a super high rating on Goodreads. Not seen too many people discuss it, but I thought it was so interesting. And yeah, this book follows, well, really you follow the perspective of one employee at a old, dilapidated, grungy cinema that is well loved by its employees. And everyone's honestly quite a character. And this is another character-driven story that's very much about the setting of the book. There isn't like a huge plot. And I think the biggest sort of plot point is that later on this cinema gets bought out when the owner dies by this big corporate chain, and things start to change around the workplace a lot. And that creates a lot of difficulties for the characters and makes things even more sort of hectic. And at that point, I really felt like there was a pretty serious nod to certain conversations about menial and low-paid minimum wage work, about sort of corporatism, workplace surveillance, and just labor issues and labor rights in general, and specifically tied to that low-wage work I mentioned that is sort of maybe considered like low skills. You see how things change for these characters, how their workplace shifts from this sort of like fun and interesting place where they kind of meet up to watch movies and discuss movies, to doing things that this corporate chain wants them to do. And it's not obvious, like it's a very short book, so it's not discussed in full, but you can I felt like I could kind of see sort of like the author putting these thoughts into this book. And yeah, I don't know, I thought that was very interesting. There's a lot of like sort of bending reality in this book, which I don't always like, but I thought it was kind of interesting here. Like some random things happen that you're not sure, like, is this really happening in this theater, or is this just sort of like the overtired main character is kind of like fugue state as she's going through work, because there is a lot of that. Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I won't be surprised if I don't see it on the short list, but I would very much like to. So those are my predictions. There's still 6 books that I haven't read, and honestly quite a few of them are books that I from the start have been very excited to read. Cursed Bread by Sophie McIntosh is one of them that I've heard mixed opinions about, but I'm excited for. And then 2 others that I've seen some pretty good things said about: Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks and The Dog of the North by Elizabeth Mackenzie. And the latter, I know she's been nominated for this prize before, so I won't be surprised if either of those make it on the short list, but I've yet to read them, so I didn't want to include them too much in this video. I hope to maybe sneak in another book before the shortlist gets announced. Once again, that's this upcoming Wednesday, April 26th, but that is very dependent on what the library has in store for me. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any shortlist predictions, if there's any books you're still really excited to read, and what your general thoughts are on any of this. So thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you again in another video.